There are moments that arrive without warning and divide your life cleanly in two. The before and the after, separated by something so small, so ordinary in its appearance, that you could not have known, in the instant before it happened, that you were standing at the last edge of the world you had always known. Mine arrived at 11:47 on a Thursday night in November, when I walked into my own kitchen to get a glass of water and heard my wife's voice through the partially open back door, speaking quietly into her phone in the garden. She was not speaking to her sister. She was not speaking to a friend. She was not arranging tomorrow's schedule or checking in on an elderly neighbor or handling any of the 100 small communications that constitute the visible administrative surface of a long marriage. I knew this before I heard a single specific word. The way you sometimes know a thing in your body before your mind has assembled the evidence for it. A quality in the voice, something in its register and its softness that I had not heard directed at me in longer than I could immediately calculate. I stood in the dark kitchen, my hand still on the cold glass I had just pulled from the cabinet, and I listened. I heard enough. My name is Martin. I am 64 years old. I spent 31 years as a secondary school headmaster in the north of England, a career that required me, daily, to read rooms, manage crises, hold the trust of hundreds of people simultaneously, and remain composed in circumstances that would have undone someone with a less disciplined relationship to their own reactions. I retired 3 years ago with a good pension, a reputation I was proud of, and a marriage of 32 years to a woman I had loved, in various forms and registers, since we were both 31 and met at an educational conference in Edinburgh, where we were the only two people at the entire event who arrived early enough to get the good seats. Her name is Catherine. She is 61 years old. She was a secondary school teacher for 24 years. English literature, which she taught with the particular passion of someone who believed, entirely without irony, that the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves are the most important subject in any curriculum. She retired 5 years ago, a year before her own schedule would have required it, because her mother had developed a diagnosis that demanded more attention than a full-time career permitted. After her mother died, 2 years ago, in February, in the quiet particular way that a long illness eventually arrives at its conclusion, Catherine had found herself in the specific disorientation of a person whose organizing purpose has been removed and who has not yet identified what replaces it. I had tried to be supportive through this period. I had been present. I had listened. I had encouraged the watercolor classes she took up and the reading group she joined and the volunteer work at the local library. I had told myself, with the quiet confidence of a man who had managed institutions for 3 decades, that I understood what my wife needed and was providing it. Standing in my dark kitchen, listening to her voice through a gap in the back door, I began to understand how wrong I had been. We have 2 children. Eleanor, 30, is a solicitor in Leeds, sharp and composed, and so entirely her mother's daughter in temperament that the two of them occasionally disagree with a ferocity that is really just mutual recognition. Our son Thomas, 27, is a junior doctor in Manchester, currently in his 2nd year of specialty training in cardiology, who calls on Sunday mornings and whose exhaustion is audible but never complained of. Both children had grown, left, built lives that were genuinely and recognizably their own. The house, since Thomas left 7 years ago, had been ours alone, Catherine's and mine, returning to the configuration of 2 people that we had been before the children arrived and had, I had assumed, simply resumed. I had not examined whether we had actually resumed it, or merely continued alongside each other in parallel, occupying the same spaces without fully sharing them. The garden door, the voice, the glass of water still cold in my hand. I went back upstairs without making a sound. I got into bed. I lay in the dark and waited for Catherine to come in, and when she did, 12 minutes later, moving quietly because she believed I was asleep, I kept my eyes closed and my breathing steady and held what I had heard in the center of my chest like a stone. I did not sleep for the rest of the night. Martin's opening establishes the crisis through an act of accidental witness rather than deliberate investigation, and this matters psychologically. He has not been looking. He did not decide to surveil his wife. He went to get a glass of water. The randomness of the discovery, its total independence from any prior suspicion, is what makes the moment so destabilizing. The world he believed in did not erode gradually under the pressure of mounting evidence. It was punctured instantaneously by a quality of voice through a garden door. Martin's professional background as a headmaster is deeply relevant to his psychological portrait. 31 years of reading rooms, managing crises, remaining composed under institutional pressure has produced a man whose relationship to his own reactions is extraordinarily disciplined, perhaps too disciplined, in the relational context of a marriage. He hears what he hears, goes upstairs, gets into bed, performs sleep, and holds the information like a stone in his chest. This is not cowardice. It is the behavioral response of someone whose entire professional identity was built around not allowing his inner state to become visible until he had fully processed it. What is significant is the specific memory that surfaces in the kitchen, the quality of Catherine's voice, its softness, something in its register that he had not heard directed at him in longer than he could calculate. This single observation contains the entire diagnosis of the marriage's long deterioration, not in what Catherine is doing wrong, but in what has been absent between them, unnoticed and unnamed, for a period of time that neither has apparently been willing to measure. Morning arrived the way it always did in our house. The particular gray-white light of a November Yorkshire dawn, seeping through the curtains at the eastern window with a patience that seemed almost grudging, as though the light itself was reluctant to illuminate another cold day. Catherine rose at her usual time. She showered. She came downstairs and put the kettle on. I heard all of this from the bedroom where I had remained, still, performing the last stages of the sleep I had never actually achieved, and then I dressed and came down, and we moved through the morning as we always moved through it. The tea, the toast, the newspaper divided between us in the comfortable shorthand of people who have shared a breakfast table for 32 years. I watched her. I want to be precise about the nature of that watching, because it was different from anything I had done before. I had spent 3 decades watching people, students, staff, parents, governors, with the particular observational precision that institutional leadership demands. I knew how to read a room. I knew how to identify, from body language and small behavioral signals, when someone was managing something that hadn't been disclosed. I had always applied this skill entirely to professional contexts. It had not occurred to me, in 32 years of marriage, to apply it to the person across the breakfast table. What I observed, on that first morning, was remarkable in its ordinariness. Catherine was, as far as the surface permitted, entirely herself. She ate her toast. She mentioned that the library reading group had a difficult title this month. She asked whether I had remembered the doctor's appointment I had scheduled for the following week. She refilled my tea without being asked, because she always did, because she had always been attentive to the small domestic courtesies that sustain the texture of shared life. Nothing about her suggested the voice I had heard in the garden. This, I would come to understand, was the most unsettling thing. Not guilt or guardedness or the microbehavioral tells of someone managing a secret, but a perfectly maintained surface, as complete and unbroken as ice on a deep pond. I thought back, carefully, across the preceding months. I had always been a person who trusts their own analysis, who does not revise documented observations in light of new information until the new information has itself been thoroughly examined. I began to examine what I had documented, without knowing I was documenting it, across the preceding year. Catherine had joined the reading group in the spring. I had encouraged this warmly, because the period following her mother's death had been one of significant withdrawal, and any engagement with the social world seemed healthy and right. The group met on Thursday evenings at the home of various members, a rotating host arrangement that meant Catherine left the house on Thursdays and returned at varying times, anywhere between 9:30 and midnight, depending on whose house it was and how long the conversation ran. She had mentioned the other members of the group with the comfortable familiarity of someone establishing a social landscape for a spouse who is not present. There was Harriet, who was retired from the NHS and had opinions about everything. There was Joanne, who had moved to the village from London 3 years ago and had not yet fully adjusted. There was Gerald, who was the only man in the group and bore this with good-natured equanimity. There was a couple whose names I had retained less well. And there was, she had mentioned him once, in October, in the context of a particularly good discussion of a Kazuo Ishiguro novel, a man named Philip. Philip had, apparently, a background in literature. He had read widely. He had said something at the reading group that Catherine had found genuinely insightful. and she had relayed this to me not with any particular emphasis, but in the conversational way of sharing a pleasant encounter. I had listened, nodded, said something about Ishiguro, and moved on. Now I retrieved the name from wherever I had filed it and turned it over with the new quality of attention I had brought to this November morning. Philip. I thought about the phone. Catherine had, in recent months, received more messages than was typical, or perhaps she had always received this volume, and I was only now noticing because the garden door had recalibrated my attention. The phone lived on the kitchen counter or beside her chair in the sitting room, and she checked it without drama, without hiding the screen, with the easy unself-consciousness of someone who has no reason for concealment, or with the ease of someone who has arranged things so that concealment is unnecessary. Our neighbor, a woman named Brenda who had known Catherine for 15 years and who was one of those people who seemed to know everything about everyone in a 3-mile radius without appearing to seek the information, knocked on the door on a Saturday in early November, 4 days after the garden incident, with a jar of preserved plums and a quality of cheerfulness that I recognized, having spent 3 decades in a management role, as the cheerfulness of someone who knows something they have. Decided not to say. She stayed for tea. She talked about the village fete committee and a planning dispute on the main road and several other items of local information. And then, as she was leaving, she said to Catherine, with the particular brightness of a woman being deliberately casual, "I saw you last Thursday, in town. You looked well." Catherine said she had been to the reading group. Brenda said, "Oh, of course. I thought it was the other direction. I must have been confused." She left. Catherine closed the door and went to put the kettle on. I stood in the hallway and thought about the other direction. The morning after scene is rendered with the specific psychological accuracy of a man who has spent a career reading behavioral signals, suddenly applying those skills to the most intimate possible subject, and finding that the surface reveals nothing. Catherine's perfect morning routine normalcy is, paradoxically, the most damning piece of evidence Martin could have encountered. A person genuinely unaware of having done anything wrong would be normal. A person who has briefly slipped and feels guilty would show micro signs of management. A person whose parallel life is sufficiently established and sufficiently practiced would also appear entirely normal, because the concealment has become habitual rather than effortful. The fact that Martin cannot distinguish between these possibilities is itself diagnostic of how long the arrangement has been in place. The retrospective archaeology of the reading group is a masterclass in the cognitive reconstruction that follows a destabilizing discovery. Every detail that was innocuous in its original context, the Thursday evenings, the variable return times, the rotating hosts, the name Philip delivered once without emphasis, is now available for re-examination with an entirely different instrument. Martin does not immediately conclude that Philip is the source. He is too careful for that. But the name has been recovered from the archive of unconsidered information and placed where it can be examined. Brenda's parting observation, the other direction, is the section's quiet detonator. It is the external confirmation that at least one element of the stated account does not match observable reality, delivered by a woman whose social intelligence is evident and whose decision to mention it gently rather than directly suggests she is offering Martin information she believes he needs without taking responsibility for its implications. I made a decision in the week following Brenda's visit, and the decision was this: I would not act on incomplete information. This was the principle I had applied across 3 decades of institutional management. The understanding that a response calibrated to a partial picture can cause more damage than the original problem, and that the first discipline of a person in authority is to know what they actually know before deciding what to do about it. What I actually knew was this: I had heard a quality in my wife's voice that suggested intimacy. I had heard Brenda imply that Catherine had been observed in a direction inconsistent with the stated route to the reading group. I had a name, Philip, attached to no certainty whatsoever. What I did not know was everything else. I began, in the quiet and methodical way of a person who spent 30 years managing complex institutions, to gather the pieces that were available to me without active surveillance. I checked the mileage on Catherine's car, a thing I could do without comment because I managed our car maintenance schedule as a matter of routine. The figure was consistent with regular local use, but not precise enough to prove or disprove specific routes. I noted it and moved on. I mentioned, in casual conversation, that I had been thinking about the reading group's schedule and whether Catherine might want to host it ours sometime. This produced a particular quality of response, not guarded, but more considered than the question warranted. She said she'd think about it. She didn't raise it again. I looked up Philip in the village. This sounds more dramatic than it was. Our village has a parish newsletter, a thing I have been aware of for 12 years and read approximately 3 times, but which contains, reliably, the kind of local information that constitutes the connective tissue of small community life. I found it online. In the autumn issue, in a section about new residents and community involvement, there was a brief paragraph about a Philip Carver who had retired to the area from a career in university English literature, was interested in joining community groups, and had recently become involved in the Thursday Reading Circle. Philip Carver, 63 years old. I noted this from the context of the paragraph. Retired academic. Widower, I would establish a week later through the quiet social cartography of village life, asking questions of nobody in particular about the reading group in the course of a conversation with our postman, who knew everyone and needed no prompting. Widower. Available. An academic background in the subject that had been the organizing passion of Catherine's professional life. I sat with these facts and applied my strongest available discipline, which is the refusal to conclude before the evidence warrants it. What I had was a coincidence of availability and shared interest. Nothing more. What I also had, and could not dismiss, was the memory of the voice. Our son Thomas came for a weekend in the middle of November. He is a young man of tremendous internal pressure, the residue of medical training and the specific moral weight of cardiology, which is a specialty that confronts its practitioners daily with the fragility of the most central human function. He carries this weight without complaint, but not without evidence. There is a quality of tiredness behind his eyes on some visits that is not physical but deeper, the tiredness of a person who witnesses too much and is permitted, professionally, to show very little. He and I took a long walk on the Saturday afternoon, as we often do when he visits, across the moorland south of the village, where the path runs along a limestone ridge with a view that extends on clear days to what feels like the curvature of the earth. We walked mostly in companionable silence, which has always been one of the reliable gifts of Thomas's company. Partway along the ridge, he said, "Is Mum all right, do you think?" I asked him what prompted the question. "She seems occupied," he said. "Not unhappy, but like there's something running in the background, like she's thinking about something she's not saying." I told him she had been going through a period of resettling since his grandmother died. He accepted this, because it was true, but I could see from the angle of his gaze across the moor that he had not been fully answered. "There's a man in her reading group," he said, after a moment. "She mentioned him 3 times at dinner last night." I counted. I looked at the horizon. "Did she?" I said. "Philip something," he said. "I'm probably reading too much into it." "You're training to be a cardiologist," I said. "You spend your days listening to the specific patterns of what is and isn't working. I don't think you read things wrong very often." He was quiet for a moment. "What are you going to do?" he said. "I'm going to be certain before I do anything," I said. We walked back in the same silence we had come in, but it was a different silence now. The silence of 2 people who have understood something together and are each, separately, deciding what it means. That evening, Catherine laughed 3 times at dinner at something Thomas said, and each time I watched her face and thought about the voice in the garden, and the laugh, and whether there was a version of the laugh I was not the recipient of, and whether the voice I had heard had been the sound of someone who had found, elsewhere, the thing I had not known I was failing to provide. 3 days later, I called my oldest friend, Raymond. Thomas's observation, 3 mentions of Philip at a single dinner, counted precisely by a man in training to notice the specific rhythms of what is and isn't functioning normally, carries the weight of a diagnostic finding. A junior cardiologist learns to listen for the patterns that deviate from baseline. What Thomas has detected over a family dinner is exactly this: a deviation from the baseline of his mother's conversational habits, a frequency of reference that exceeds what the content warrants. Martin's response, "I don't think you read things wrong very often," is both an affirmation of his son and an admission that he agrees with the reading. The Moor Walk is structured as a scene of intergenerational reckoning, a father and son walking together across open ground, approaching from different directions the same truth that neither has sufficient information to name. Martin's commitment to certainty before action, The institutional discipline he has carried from 30 years of management is simultaneously his greatest strength and his point of maximum vulnerability. Discipline prevents premature, damaging response. It can also, if not carefully monitored, become a mechanism for indefinite postponement. The question Thomas does not ask directly, "Are you going to do something about this?" is the question the story is building toward. Martin's evening observation, watching Catherine's laugh and wondering whether there exists a version of it he is not the recipient of, is perhaps the section's most emotionally precise moment. It names, without stating, the specific grief of a person who has begun to suspect that the most alive version of the person they love is being shared with someone else. Raymond has been my closest friend since we were both deputy heads at neighboring schools in the 1990s, sharing the particular solidarity of middle management in educational institutions that were each, in their own way, in the early stages of becoming something different from what they had been. He is 66 now, retired from his own headship 2 years before me, and he lives in Harrogate with his second wife. His first marriage ended in his late 40s under circumstances that had left him, he always said, with the kind of specific knowledge about relational breakdown that he would have preferred to acquire theoretically. I drove to Harrogate on a Tuesday, and we had lunch. I told Raymond what I had heard and what I had since assembled, with the sequential precision of a man presenting a case, and he listened with the stillness of someone who has been on the receiving end of this kind of account before and knows that interruption is not what's needed. When I finished, he said, "What do you want to be true?" The question stopped me. I had not expected it. "I want to be wrong," I said, after a moment. "Of course you do," he said. "What do you want to be true about what you do next?" I thought about this. "I want to know the full truth before I say anything," I said. "Not assume, not confront on inadequate grounds." "No," he nodded. "Then you need someone who can verify what you can't." He gave me a name. A retired detective, a woman named Sonia Pierce, who had moved into private investigative work after her police service and who was, Raymond said, absolutely precise and absolutely discreet. He had used her himself, a decade ago, under circumstances he did not detail. I called Sonia Pierce the following morning. She was exactly what Raymond had described. Precise, economical with language, asking only the questions that directly served the purpose of her work. I gave her the relevant information, Catherine's schedule, the reading group, the name Philip Carver, and commissioned a 2-week engagement. During those 2 weeks, I continued to live in the house on the terms we had always lived in it. This is the part that is most difficult to explain to someone who has not been through it, because there is something deeply surreal about the maintenance of ordinary life when ordinary life has been recontextualized entirely. Catherine and I had dinner. We watched 2 films. We went to a friend's birthday gathering in the village, a Sunday lunch that ran long and cheerful, at which Catherine was warm and engaged and entirely herself, and at which I watched her across the table with the double consciousness of a man who is both present and not. I did not perform unhappiness. I did not perform suspicion. I performed Martin Fielding, which had become, in those 2 weeks, a more demanding role than I had previously understood it to be. Sonia Pierce called me on a Wednesday in late November. She asked to meet. I drove to her office in the next town, a ground-floor suite of rooms above a solicitor's office, furnished with the practical modesty of someone who understands that what she provides is information, not atmosphere. She put a folder on the desk between us. The information was thorough. Philip Carver was who the parish newsletter had described, a retired academic, 63, widowed. He lived in a converted farmhouse on the eastern side of the village, approximately 3 miles from our house by the road Catherine would take if she went in the direction Brenda had observed. He and Catherine had, over Sonia's 2-week observation period, met 5 times. 3 times at his house, on 2 Thursday evenings that Catherine had described as reading group nights, and on a Wednesday afternoon when she had told me she was at the library. Twice in a cafe in the market town 12 miles away, on a Tuesday and the following Thursday, the Tuesday being a day with no stated cover at all. She had simply not been home when she had implied she would be, and I had not, I realized with a specific private shame, noticed. The documentation confirmed an ongoing relationship of at minimum several months, conducted during time Catherine had accounted for as otherwise occupied, in locations that required a deliberate routing away from the expected path. It did not document the nature of the relationship in any detail beyond the physical fact of sustained private meetings. Sonia was precise about the limits of what observation could establish versus what it could not. What she could confirm was meeting. What she could not confirm, from external observation alone, was everything else. I thanked her. I paid the invoice. I drove home along the moorland road in the November gray and thought about the precise, careful distinction between what I now knew and what I had not yet been told directly. That evening, after dinner, as Catherine was washing up and I was drying, a division of domestic labor we had maintained with unthinking consistency for 3 decades, I stood beside her at the sink and said, very quietly, "I think we need to talk, Catherine." She went still, not the natural stillness of a pause, the specific stillness of a person who has been waiting for something to arrive and has just heard it knock. "All right," she said. She did not ask what about. The 2-week maintenance of ordinary life during the investigative period is where Martin's professional discipline most dramatically serves and most severely costs him. It serves him because it prevents a premature confrontation built on insufficient evidence, the institutional lesson applied correctly. It costs him because the performance of normalcy during this period requires a suppression of emotional reality, so complete that Martin describes himself as performing Martin Fielding, a formulation that captures the profound uncanniness of becoming a character in one's own life, observing oneself from outside. Raymond's question, "What do you want to be true?" is the most psychologically sophisticated moment in this section because it redirects Martin from the investigative frame to the personal one. A man focused entirely on establishing facts can lose sight of what the facts are for. Raymond, with the experiential authority of someone who has navigated his own marital collapse, understands that the purpose of certainty is not certainty itself, but the capacity to act from a place of emotional clarity rather than a place of managed rage or projected fear. Sonia Pierce's confirmation, 5 meetings across 2 weeks, 3 at his home, 2 Wednesdays and Thursdays accounted for by cover stories, is significant less for what it proves than for what it eliminates. The remaining uncertainty is not whether the relationship exists, but what its precise nature is. Martin's decision to hold this distinction, to know everything the external record provides while acknowledging what it cannot, is the behavior of a man committed to fairness even in extremis. Catherine's stillness when he says, "I think we need to talk," and her failure to ask what about, is the confirmation he did not need from Sonia Pierce. She has been waiting for this knock. She knows exactly what door it is. We sat in the sitting room, the room where we had sat through 32 years of evenings, beneath the particular low light of the standing lamp Catherine had chosen in 1998 and which had survived 4 house moves and 3 reupholstered sofas and 2 children's various phases of attempting to repurpose it for dramatic effect. I had always found the room comfortable. That evening, it felt like a stage set, perfectly correct in every detail, and therefore slightly unreal. I placed the folder on the coffee table. I did not open it. I simply placed it there and let it exist between us, and Catherine looked at it, and then looked at me, and the quality of her gaze in that moment told me more than anything Sonia Pierce had documented. "His name is Philip Carver," I said. "I know you've been meeting him. I know it began some months ago. I know the reading group has been providing a partial cover, and that some of the evenings were spent at his house. I know about the Wednesday afternoons." I paused. "I would like you to tell me the rest." The silence that followed was not the silence of someone constructing a denial. It was the silence of someone deciding how to begin. "How long have you known?" she asked. "I heard you in the garden on a Thursday in November," I said. "The rest has accumulated since." She put her hands in her lap. She looked at them. She is not a person given to theatrical self-presentation. One of the qualities I have always found most trustworthy about her is that her distress, when it arrives, is private rather than performed. What I saw on her face in that moment was private distress in its pure form. "I met him in September," she said, "at the reading group. We talked about the Ishiguro." She paused. "He understood what I was saying before I finished saying it. I know how that sounds. Tell me what it means to you," I said. "Not how it sounds." She looked at me then, and there was something in the look that I recognized, distantly, as the expression she had worn in Edinburgh 33 years ago, when I had said something she had not expected, the look of a person encountering an unanticipated quality in someone they thought they had already fully understood. "It means I had forgotten," she said quietly. what it felt like to be met. Intellectually, the way we used to. Martin, do you remember when we used to talk? Not about the house, or the children, or the schedule. About books, about ideas, about what we actually thought about things. I said nothing, because I was thinking about when I had last initiated a conversation of that kind. I could not immediately identify the occasion. I'm not saying that's your fault, she said quickly. I'm not. I'm not trying to make this into an argument about whose fault it is. I'm trying to tell you what happened, truthfully. Tell me all of it, I said. Not the version that's easiest. The true one. She told me. The conversation moved through all of it. The reading group meetings, the growing private correspondence, the first occasion they had met alone, the nature of what had developed between them. She did not minimize and she did not elaborate for effect. She told me the truth in the flat, careful way of someone who understands that the truth, at this stage, is the only currency that holds any value. It had been physical, not for long, not at the center of the relationship, but the distinction between emotional and physical intimacy had not held. She told me this without flinching. I sat with it. Why didn't you end it? I asked, when it became clear what it was. She was quiet for a long moment. Because it was the first time in a long time that I felt like Catherine, she said. Not Catherine your wife, or Catherine mum, or Catherine who used to teach. Just myself. And I was afraid that ending it meant losing that again. I looked at the room around us. The lamp Catherine had chosen. The books on the shelves, mostly hers. The reading glasses on the side table, the small pile of library returns, the particular accumulation of a shared life that had gathered like sediment over 3 decades. Did you think about what it would mean for this? I said. I told myself it was separate, she said. I know. You told yourself a story, I said. She flinched slightly. Yes. I thought about what she had said, what it felt like to be met. I thought about the conversations we used to have and did not have anymore. I thought about the 31 years of managing an institution and the particular way that professional habits of composure and efficiency had spread, gradually and without announcement, into the domestic space of our marriage, until I was managing our home the way I had managed my school, effectively, reliably, and from a slight emotional remove that I had never identified as a remove because it had the appearance of capability. I thought about all the evenings in this room that I had spent with a book or a newspaper or a screen, managing the comfortable silence of a long marriage and calling it closeness. The folder, I said, is documentation from a private investigator. I want you to know that exists. I want you to know I will not use it against you. Not in any legal sense, not as leverage. I used it to understand the full picture before I spoke to you, because I needed to do that. That's all it is now. She looked at the folder and then at me. All right, she said. I don't know what I want to do. I said honestly. I know that I am. I am deeply hurt, Catherine, in ways I haven't fully measured yet. I know that some of what you've said tonight has made me look at myself with questions I should probably have been asking for a long time. I paused. I know that 32 years means something real, and I am not willing to make an irreversible decision about it tonight. She said, what do you need from me? The truth, going forward, I said. Complete and ongoing. And time to think. And Philip? She said. That's finished, I said. It was not a question. She closed her eyes. Yes, she said. It was already. I had already been trying to, she stopped. Yes, it's finished. We sat in the lamplight for a long time after that. Not touching, not quite separate. In the particular suspended state of two people who have just survived something and do not yet know what the survival will cost. The confrontation achieves a quality of emotional honesty that is rare in stories of this kind. It refuses the gratification of either a complete villain or a simple victim. Catherine's account, the first time in a long time I felt like Catherine, names a genuine psychological reality that does not excuse the choices made, but does explain the hunger that drove them. Role engulfment, the erosion of individual identity within the accumulated functions of a long marriage, is a documented and common experience for women of Catherine's generation and circumstances. Decades of teaching, caring, mothering, supporting, and then, in retirement, a sudden absence of the structures that had organized the self, met not by help and reconstruction, but by an assumption that the adjustment would occur naturally. Martin's recognition that he had managed their marriage with the same efficient composure with which he had managed his school, maintaining comfortable silence and calling it closeness, is the scene's most significant moment of self-accountability. He has been, by the conventional metrics, an excellent husband, present, reliable, faithful, caring. But presence without availability, reliability without receptivity, faithfulness without genuine intimacy constitute a form of partnership that can sustain years of ordinary life and fail entirely at the specific moment when a person most needs to be truly seen. His statement that he is not willing to make an irreversible decision tonight is the mature response of a man who has been through enough not to trust the emotional clarity of acute crisis. This is wisdom, and it opens the possibility that the story, unlike many of its kind, will refuse the easy ending. The weeks that followed were the most difficult of my adult life, more difficult, in some ways, than the bereavements I had experienced, because grief for the dead moves in a direction, has a known destination however long the path, whereas what I was navigating had no mapped route and no certain arrival point. I was not sure whether my marriage was over. I was not sure whether I wanted it to be. I was not sure whether the man I had been within it, capable, composed, reliably present, and emotionally remote, was a man I was willing to continue being. These are uncomfortable uncertainties to sit with at 64. I am not a young man. I do not have the luxury of believing that whatever comes next will be long enough to absorb whatever is lost in getting there. But I had spent 64 years being very confident about what I knew, and the November garden had disabused me of confidence in a way I could not simply reaccumulate by deciding to. I told Eleanor on a Wednesday in December, in a phone call that lasted 2 hours and that went through several registers, her shock, her anger on my behalf, her careful, lawyerly attempt to assess the facts, and then, at the end, her quiet and genuine question. What do you want, Dad? Not what you think you should do. What do you actually want? It was, I noted, the same question Raymond had asked me. I told her I wanted to understand whether the marriage could become something worth staying in, rather than simply something I had not yet found reason to leave. The distinction seemed important. She said she understood. Thomas came home for Christmas. The house had the particular, complicated warmth of a family gathering in which everyone knows something significant is in the air and has agreed, by unspoken consensus, to let the children's presence take precedence over the adult difficulty. We managed Christmas with a care and a courtesy that was not dishonest. Catherine and I were not performing happiness we did not feel, but we were also not performing the fracture we were actively managing. We were two people in the middle of a long, uncertain conversation, maintaining the forms of their shared life because the forms were not the problem and dismantling them would not have served anyone. On Boxing Day, when the children had gone to see friends, Catherine and I sat at the kitchen table with tea and the remains of the previous day's food, and we talked for 4 hours. We talked about Edinburgh. We talked about the early years of the marriage, when we had spent weekends in bed with novels and arguments about them, when conversation had been the primary form of our intimacy. We talked about the years of the children, when the density of parenting had organized everything else and conversation had become efficient and task-oriented and neither of us had noticed the narrowing. We talked about the retirement years, hers first, then mine, and the particular failure of that transition, which should have been a restoration of the early marriage's spaciousness and was instead a continuation of its habits, just without the external justification. I stopped talking to you, I said, in the way that mattered. I don't know exactly when. We both did, she said. I stopped telling you things, real things. And then it had been so long that I didn't know how to start again. And then someone made it easy to start again, I said. With him. Yes, she said. That's not a justification, I said. No, she said. But it's an explanation. And I think you need the explanation to be complete, even if it doesn't make what I did forgivable. I looked at her across the table. This woman I had known for 33 years, who had been, for 32 of them, the organizing center of my life in ways I had apparently never fully acknowledged, and I thought about forgiveness. What it actually was. Not the performed absolution of the magnanimous betrayed partner, but the real thing. The decision to release the debt, not because it doesn't exist, but because carrying it is a choice with its own costs. I had not arrived at that decision yet. We began to see a therapist in January. His name was Dr. Jeffrey Marsh, and he was a man of 60 or so with a background in existential psychotherapy, which is, as he explained in our first session, less concerned with behavior modification than with the more fundamental questions of what a given life has been built on and what it might, genuinely, be rebuilt toward. He was the right choice for us. I understood this from the first session, in which he asked us each, separately, to describe the marriage as though it belonged to someone else. The descriptions we each gave were recognizably of the same marriage and entirely different from each other. And this gap, the space between my account and Catherine's, was where the real work began. I will not detail the months of that work, because some of it belongs to a privacy that should not be converted into testimony. What I will say is that by spring, something had shifted, not resolved, not repaired in the sense of restoration, but shifted in the direction of a different understanding between us. Catherine ended the relationship with Philip Carver, not under my ultimatum, but of her own decision, which she made and communicated to him before we began the therapy. I did not verify this independently. I chose to trust it, which was its own act of will, requiring a daily renewal. Eleanor asked me again, in April, what I wanted. I want to find out whether we can become a different version of what we were, I said. Not the old one with the damage repaired. A genuinely different one. Is that possible? She asked. I don't know, I said, but I think it's what I'm trying for. There is a particular irony in the fact that the thing which most nearly destroyed our marriage, the Thursday night garden, the voice I was not supposed to hear, was also the thing that forced the specific, overdue confrontation with what our marriage had actually become rather than what we had been telling ourselves it was. I do not think I would have initiated that confrontation otherwise. I do not think Catherine would have. We had both been, for some years, choosing the comfort of the unexamined over the difficulty of the true, and the voice in the garden ended that option. I walk in the mornings now, across the moor, along the limestone ridge where Thomas and I walked in November. The light in April is entirely different from the light in November, warmer, directional, arriving at a low angle that illuminates the specific texture of things, the grain of the stone wall, the individual blades of moorland grass, the particular quality of the path. I notice this more than I used to. I think I have become, in the aftermath of everything, a more attentive person. Not because loss improved me in any simple sense, but because the loss of certainty, the loss of the comfortable belief that I knew exactly what my life was, restored something I had not known I had lost, the willingness to look at things as though they might reveal something unexpected. Research in relational psychology consistently suggests that couples who survive major trust violations and rebuild their relationships describe the rebuilt relationship as more honest and more genuinely intimate than the one that preceded the crisis. Not because the crisis was good, but because the crisis forced the abandonment of the comfortable fictions that had sustained the original, and because only on the far side of that abandonment could a genuine thing be built. I do not know yet whether Catherine and I will be among those couples. I know that we are still trying. That is, for now, enough. Martin's resolution carries the distinctive weight of a man who has resisted the pull of two opposite conclusions: the premature forgiveness of a person desperate to restore familiarity, and the decisive ending of a person prioritizing self-protection over the complexity of 32 years. His commitment to finding out whether they can become a genuinely different version rather than the old one with the damage repaired is both psychologically sophisticated and narratively honest. It refuses the false comfort of either the reconciliation story or the clean break story and sits, with remarkable patience, in the difficult space between. The Boxing Day conversation is the section's emotional center. Two people reviewing the archaeology of their own marriage, Edinburgh, the years with the children, the narrowing of conversation into efficiency, the retirement that should have been a restoration and was instead a continuation of habits, are doing something that most couples never do: examining the actual, specific history of how they arrived at where they are rather than simply experiencing the consequences of it. Martin's observation that he stopped talking in the way that mattered, without knowing exactly when, is the story's most honest line. The admission that the primary failure of the marriage was not dramatic but erosive, a slow, mutual, unnoticed retreat from the kind of intellectual and emotional intimacy that had originally defined them. The morning walks on the moor, and Martin's restored capacity to notice the specific texture of the light at a different angle, are the story's final image of what loss, navigated with honesty and patience, can restore, not the original certainty, but something less comfortable and more valuable: the willingness to look at things as though they might still surprise you. Martin and Catherine's story is ultimately a study in the specific damage that institutional competence can inflict on intimate life. A man who spent 31 years developing extraordinary skill in reading rooms, managing crises, and maintaining composed authority brought those same skills to his marriage, and in doing so, gradually converted a relationship built on intellectual intimacy and genuine mutual encounter into a well-managed household in which both parties were comfortable, reliable, and fundamentally alone. The tragedy is not that Martin was a bad husband by conventional measurement. He was attentive, faithful, present, and caring. The tragedy is that these qualities, delivered through the medium of managed efficiency, created a domestic environment in which Catherine's need for genuine encounter, for the specific experience of being met, intellectually and emotionally, as a full person rather than as a function of the household, went not just unmet but unrecognized. She did not leave gradually. She filled the gap privately, and then, when the private filling became unsustainable, presented Martin with a truth she had been carrying alone for months. The chain of revelation, voiced through the garden door, Brenda's observation, Thomas's counted references, Sonia Pierce's documentation, mirrors the structure of the concealment itself, built from small, individually explicable pieces that only constitute a complete picture when assembled with the right instrument and the right attention. Martin's ultimate arc is from institutional manager to present husband, a transition that required the loss of his most foundational certainty to initiate, and that may never be fully complete, but that is, in its imperfect and ongoing form, the most genuinely human thing he has done in years. The statistical truth that couples who survive major trust violations often describe what follows as more honest than what preceded it is not consolation. It is a description of the cost at which genuine intimacy is sometimes purchased. Some things can only be built on the far side of the collapse of what they replace. Whether Martin and Catherine will build them remains, as he says, an open question. But the fact that they are still asking it, together, in the April light on the Yorkshire moor, is itself an answer of a kind.